Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Distinguished Scholar Panel today, honoring Wu Hong. My name is John Tain. I am head of who, in some ways, needs no introduction, I think, for those of you here. So I'll just move on to the first speaker. No, so Wu Hong is Harrie A. Vanderstappen, Distinguished Service Professor of Art History and East Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago, where he is also director of the Center for the Art of East Asia and the consulting curator of the Smart Museum of Art. Before that, he was a professor at Harvard University from 1987 to 1994. He has published widely on both traditional and contemporary Chinese art, and his interest in both has led him to experiment with different ways to integrate these conventionally separate phases into new kinds of art historical narratives, as exemplified by his monumentality in early Chinese screen medium and representation of Chinese pictorial art, 1996, Remaking Beijing, Tiananmen Square, The Creation of a Political Space, 2005, A Story of Ruins, Presence and Absence in Chinese Art and Visual Culture, 2012, and Zooming In, Histories of Photography in China, 2016. Wu Hong has also a distinguished curatorial career, having had an auspicious start on the research staff of the Palace Museum in Beijing from 1973 to 1978. Since staging exhibitions at Harvard University's Adams House Lower Common Room in the mid-1980s, he has gone on to organize many groundbreaking exhibitions, among them the first Guangzhou Triennial in 2002, the sixth Guangzhou Biennial in 2006, Su Reinventing Books in Contemporary Chinese Art 2006 as well, Between Past and Future, New Photography and Video from China 2004, which traveled to multiple venues across the US and Europe, Displacement, The Three Gorges Dam, and Contemporary Chinese Art, 2008, and more recently, an exhibition about exhibitions displaying contemporary art in the 1990s, 2016. He is an elected member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, and sits on the boards and advisory committees of many research institutes and museums in the United States and China, including the OCT Contemporary Art Center in China, the Institute of Fine Arts at NYU, and the Guggenheim Museum. His accomplishments have been recognized countless times and broadly, and nor is this even the first time he has been recognized by CAA, since he received the Distinguished Teaching Award in 2008. Wu Hong will be delivering the Andrew W. Mellon Lectures at the National Art Gallery in 2019, and he will be responding after our four speakers. Our first speaker will be Chris Urquhams. Chris Urquhams has been curator of global contemporary and Asian art at the Spencer Museum since 2010, and oh, Eugene, I'm sorry. Okay. Eugene, since 2005, Eugene Wang has been Abby Aldridge Rockefeller Professor of Asian Art at Harvard University. He joined the Department of History of Art and Architecture there in 1997, the year he received his doctorate. Prior to that, he had been on the faculty of the University of Chicago, a Guggenheim Fellow, 2005, and recipient of ACLS and Getty Grants. He served as the art history associate editor of the Encyclopedia of Buddhism, Macmillan 2004. His book, Shaping the Lotus Sutra, Buddhist Visual Culture of Medieval China 2005, received the Academic Excellence Award from Japan in 2006. His extensive publications covered the entire range of Chinese art history, from ancient funerary art to modern and contemporary Chinese art and cinema. He serves on the advisory board of the Center of Advanced Studies National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., and the editorial board of the Art Bulletin. And recently, he started the Chinese Media Lab at Harvard University. And following him will be Ji-Hee Hong. Ji Hong is an associate professor and Greta Chambers chair in East Asian art history in the Department of Art History and Communication Studies at McGill. She is a specialist in the ritual art and visual cultures of Middle Period China, 9th to 14th century CE. Her first book, Theater of the Dead, A Social Turn in Chinese Funerary Art, 1000 to 1400, 2016, explores complex intersections of the visual, mortuary, and everyday worlds, and demonstrates a new phase in the conception of the netherworld and the practice of ancestral worship in China at the beginning of the second millennium. She is currently working on three main topics. The first project engages the ontological understanding of the face as a field of negotiation among social, religious, visual conventions in the visual arts of Middle Period China. The second investigates changing epistemology of sense perception in the visual field from early to middle period. The third is a collaborative effort to probe the boundaries and localities of visual cultures in medieval and middle period China. Her research questions bring together various mediums and formal categories of art, often inspired by cross-cultural phenomena in the visual world. Now, going back to Chris Urkums. Chris has been curator of global contemporary and Asian art at the Spencer Museum at the University of Kansas since 2010, and a curator of Asian art there since 2007. Prior to joining the Spencer, Urkums resided in Beijing, where he conducted research as part of a Fulbright-Hays Doctoral Research Abroad Fellowship. In 2014, Urkums completed his doctorate at the University of Chicago in Chinese art history. His dissertation examined the development of modern art exhibition culture in China during the early 20th century. In 2009, Urkums was awarded a curatorial research fellowship from the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts to investigate the interface between technology and contemporary artistic practice across Asia. Building on this research project, Urkums has organized 6 international artist-in-residence projects at the Spencer with artists such as Wang Tiande, Kim Jongku, Jing San, Chen Shaoshen, and Xing Jingmen, and Diego Tiao. Urkums has also curated Extraordinary Video Art from Asia 2010 and XY, and most recent 2009, and more recently the 2016 exhibition Temporal Turn, Art and Speculation in Contemporary Art, which explores a rich mosaic of ideas about time and history from a generation of artists embedded in what has been dubbed the Asian century. And then last but not least, Lydian Ten. Lydian Ten, an associate professor of East Asian art and archaeology at the Institute of for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU, specializes in ancient Chinese art and archaeology. Prior to joining the Institute in 2010, she served as associate professor in the Department of the History of Art at Yale University. Ten received her BA and MA in history from National Taiwan University, and her PhD in the history of art and architecture from Harvard University. She was awarded a postdoctoral fellowship from the Getty Foundation, a Morse Junior Faculty Fellowship from Yale, and 2 fellowships from the Tsinghua Foundation for International Scholarly Exchange. She is the author of Picturing Heaven in Early China, Harvard University Press 2011. She has also published a number of articles concerned with diverse cultural issues in Chinese art. Ten is currently at work on 2 book projects, one on a book project investigating the reception of antiquity and its impact on visual production in 18th century China, and another which examines frontiers and visual imaginations in Han China. So with that, I will cede the podium to Eugene Wang.
Can you hear me in the back? Yes? Okay. Today I'm going to talk about, I'm going to tell a story of 2 individuals. One was hailed as the father of modern architecture. The other brought Chinese art history to another level. They may have never met, however, brought their footprints together. You've probably guessed it. Liang Sichen and Wu Hong. Both pursued their PhD in history of art and architecture at Harvard, though Liang never finished his dissertation. Despite the 6 decades that set them apart, they shared one interest. They were both fixated on a monument known as the Wuliang Shrine. Liang graduated from University of Pennsylvania in 1927 and went on to pursue his PhD study at Harvard in the fall of the same year. A terracotta model tower at the Harvard Folk Art Museum caught his attention. He wrote an essay on it. Poring over its detail, however, his thought repeatedly turned elsewhere. Quote, "The reliefs from the Wu family tombs," he muses, "show a number of 2 or 3-story buildings," unquote. His analysis of the tower is largely rigorous and academic. However, little are we prepared for this eruption of a poetic flight of fancy. Quote, "The 3rd or the top story has a balcony. The enclosed space forms a protruded sill of considerable room. The sweet daughter of the house must have carefully caressed her delicate flower, planted in pots and placed on the sill. Or else she must have leaned pensively over this high window, meditating about some romantic prince charm that might one day come from distant land to ask her father for her hand, unquote. Liang might as well speak for himself. He did exactly that in those housing days. The year after his Harvard stint, he married his fiancée, Lin Huiying, a brilliant student of architecture and drama. Harvard in those days must have been a very enchanted place for Chinese students. There was a trend of male students marrying female students of drama. A student of economics at Harvard named Wu Baosan did precisely that in 1938. Like Liang, he too married a student of drama. Her name is Sun Jiaxiu, a Mount Holyoke College graduate who went on to become a renowned scholar of Shakespeare in China. Like Liang and Lin, Wu and Sun too got married in a Chinese embassy, though Liang and Lin in Ottawa and Wu and Sun in Berlin. They bore a son whom they named Wu Hong. The family tradition continued. Decades later, Wu Hong also married a student of dramatic literature named Julius Zeilen. Wu Hong began his PhD study at Harvard in 1980, half a century after Liang. Like Liang Shichen, he too became fixated on the Wuliang Shrine. There is a difference. Liang gave up on the Han Monument, Wu did not. The rest is history. Wu's dissertation turned monograph went on to win the Joseph Levinson Book Prize in 1991. So with Wu Hong, in the beginning was the Han. However, in view of both Chinese art history and Wu's own scholarly career, this is a curious beginning. There was more than millennia worth of pre-Han art to account for, nor did Wu Hong's own scholarly career start from Han. He had in fact started from Shang jade figurines. Why did he then settle on a Han monument to begin his American academic career? I never asked him. I, however, could conjure up circumstantial reasons. At Harvard, he befriended Wilma Fairbank, one of the pioneers in the study of Han period art, a fine art student of Radcliffe College and an apprentice to the Mexican muralist Diego Rivera. Wilma discovered China with her husband, John King Fairbank, a leading scholar of modern China. Wilma was a female Indiana Jones venturing into rural China in search of ancient monuments. She rediscovered the Wuliang Shrine and studied through her Radcliffe-trained art historical lens. Her methodology galvanized the modern scholarship on monumental art in China. On her field trips, Wilma was often accompanied by none other than Liang and Lin. They remained lifelong friends. Wilma survived both and went on to write a biography of the couple who would become the founders of modern discipline of architectural history in China. To recall, Liang pursued his PhD study of Chinese architectural history at Harvard between 1927 and 1928. What was his dissertation topic? On the basis of his manifested obsession with the Wuliang Shrine, it may well be his dissertation topic. If so, why did he give up? In the heydays and heady days of history making, it is hard not to conceive art and architectural history in civilizational terms. Monuments, as the early telling goes, anchor civilizations. Greek temples are standard bearers. For monument-minded scholar like Liang, it is all too logical to look for Chinese equivalent of Greek temples, a culture that favors timber frame architecture over stone masonry. China posed a problem. Liang tried to infer from existing model towers and shrines the monumental Han architecture. It must be hard to keep on projecting monumentality into the miniature tower or the small-scale Han shrines, for that matter. So Liang eventually dropped his project on Han monuments. Where Han frustrated him, Tang gratified him. He found his monumentality in the grandeur of the Tang Buddhist temples, as evidenced in Japan, where Tang-style temple still stand tall. He went on to discover the oldest surviving Tang timber frame architecture on Wutaishan in China. It is interesting to stack up Wu against Liang. Liang gave up on hand monuments and Wu did not. Now we understand why Liang did so. We have yet to fully understand why Wu did not. Maybe it was because he saw the limitation of the state of field of Chinese art in his days. It was then heavily skewed towards two camps, early bronzes and later scrolls. In between was the lonely hero Alexander Super, minding his own business of mining the monumental Buddhist art nearly all by himself. With the bronze and scrolls bookending the Chinese art history, the monumental in between was given a short shrift. Wu saw that and sought to readdress the lacuna. The intellectual tools available in the 1980s also made a difference. It was the heady days of post-structural thinking. Liang gave up hand towers out of disappointment with the lack of monumental scale. Wu could live with hand monuments after reconceptualizing, if not deconstructing, monumentality. To him, hand monuments were the staging ground for both embrace and undermine monumentality. Looking for Chinese counterparts of Greek temples may be barking the wrong tree. Chinese monumentality may reside in not so monumental bronze vessels, as Wu later argued, whose association with the temple offerings give them gravitas. Hand funerary shrines may be small in size. Their monumentality resides not in their scale, but in their temporal, spatial expansiveness that encompasses heaven and earth in a microcosm. The Wuliang Shrine then became the launch pad for Wu Hong and his students. It branches into, first of all, ever-deepening probes into processes, that is, asking questions about how the imaginary afterlife processes translate into programmatic disposition of physical artifacts in tombs and shrines. It prompts questions about media, ink rubbings, for instance, as a curious paper and ink-based Chinese art medium that both replicates and effaces objects. It leads to topography, ruins and transience, sights and memory, materiality and phenomenology. Here, I run the risk of reductionism. It is as if one can reduce the entirety of Wu Hong's prodigious scholarship to the Wuliang Shrine. One cannot. The point is not to show the breadth of Wu Hong's scholarship, but to observe his its robust metabolism. That is, how a seed, once planted, can generate new life and how it may look forward. Back to Liang and Wu, the quest for monumentality brought them together one more time. Liang designed the monument to people's heroes. Wu wrote about the same site and monument half a century later. Again, the difference is palpable. Liang hoped to give form and substance to decades-long collective aspiration for a new China. Ironically, as he was trying to solidify that elusive dream vision, he was forced to go through a thought reform. He ended up in a conceptual limbo, lost in the dizzying change of political winds, unable to lash onto any conceptual scaffolding, whether it was early modernist training in Yupan or the Soviet-inflected new classical model to which he adapted, or archaizing nationalism. It is that pathos or that tragic loss of any firm foundation that Wu deftly documents in his writing about monuments in Beijing. The cover image of his book aptly captures the nature of the project. The artist Song Dong breathes his breath into the wintry surface of the stone ground on Tiananmen Square. The living breath congeals and solidifies into temporal forms, but the form is a mirage. It soon dissolves into the thin air. The square carries heavy memories, some of which Wu lived through personally. In the 1960s, Wu was put in a reform camp, rooming with Dong Xiwen, the artist who painted the grand composition of the founding of PRC. As history gets repeatedly revised, so is the painting in its 4 iterations. Figures are dropped as they morph from one day's hero to a next day's villains. During the reform camp confinement, Dong remained reticent. Following his release, he went home to repair a Song ceramic vase that had been smashed by the Red Guard. Having put the broken pieces back into a hole, he quietly passed away. Monument versus vessels, we recall, is a theme running deep in Wu Hong's writing about monumentality. Back to the square, Lin Huiying also participated in the design of the memorial to the people's hero. She certainly had a fair sense of drama. Back in the 1920s, she studied drama at Yale. The Lin family's connection to Yale actually runs deep. Lin had a niece who went to Yale to study architecture. Who else could it be, a Yale student with the family name of Lin? Of course, Maya Lin, who went to design, what else, a monument. Maya Lin's minimalist design provided a pristine formal closure to an emotionally inchoate and unsettling phase of history. It is not clear if her upbringing in a Chinese family had left any indelible imprint on the memorial. In any case, her design resonates deeply with the Chinese stele tradition. Both rely on the formal array of inscriptions. This inscription-heavy design was inadvertently recapitulated in a Chinese film, Old Well. The film tells a heart-wrenching story of generations of Loess-dwelling villagers in search of well sites. The quest often results in bloody fights and death is caused by the collapse of wells. The question for the filmmaker is how then to bring the narrative to a convincing closure. The finale of a massive euphoria over water spurting out of a well would have told the line of a triumphalist socialist realist narrative. However, in the self-reflexive 1980s, the cliche would not sit well. So a monument with minimalist design was the solution. The camera pans down a stele over relentless rows of names of the dead in a centuries-long history of futile well digging on an arid Loess. The repeated inscription follows the same order. The year, the number of wells dug, the same result of no water, and the death toll. Folly of heroism and heroism of folly. The film ends on a note of profound pathos, much like the Vietnam Veteran Memorial. A young critic attending the opening screening in 1987, he subsequently published an article in an English language journal Framework and submitted that essay as writing sample in his application for PhD study in art history at Harvard with Wu Hong. Wu naturally had a soft spot for anyone proposing to study monuments. Upon reading the essay, he immediately picked up the phone and called the applicant. The rest is history. That applicant became one of Wu Hong's first students. Not coincidentally, his own first art bulletin publication features, what else? The Wu Liang Shrine. Today, he's here standing in front of you speaking. So for the Wu family, in the beginning was the Wu Liang Shrine, and the quest for monumentality continues. Thank you, Maestro.
Thank you very much, Eugene, for this very stimulating opening speech. Full disclosure before I start, we didn't get to rehearse, so we didn't know what we were going to talk about, each other's topics. So it's very, very exciting to see many things actually kind of resonating with some of what I'm going to talk about today. Today, it is my greatest pleasure and honor to be in this room today in honor of Professor Wu Hong's scholarly achievement throughout his career. In reflecting on extremely diverse and seminal works he has contributed in the field of art history, I have had a reminiscing moment of my first graduate years back in Seoul 2 decades ago as an aspiring intellectual historian when I was first drawn to the field of art history. So it was Wu Hong's monumentality in early Chinese art and architecture that opened my eyes towards the fascinating visual world of the past in the most tangible manner. One of countless insights presented in this book that inspired me was the ways in which source materials, both visual and textual, were transformed into historical evidence. In retrospective, this was a crucial moment for a future art history student to begin thinking seriously about what constitutes the so-called source and at what point the source becomes evidence. This question of evidence and a source, I believe, has been and will always be one of the core issues in our understanding of the past as well as the present. And it is something that I'd like to address today in a reflection of Professor Wu Hong's rich scholarship and its impact on the field. In particular, I'll be focusing on how archaeological material, which used to engage only a limited range of scholarly fields in sinology, became a common and integral source of Chinese art today. My discussion will further touch upon some of the exciting new avenues of research that bear clear marks of Wu Hong's contribution. So by the time two of Wu Hong's books on the early Chinese art, the Ouyang Shrine and the Monumentality in Early Chinese Art and Architecture appeared, the dominant scholarship in the field of Chinese art history in North America had largely centered on medium of painting, especially the paintings that had been transmitted through various channels of collectors. The state of the field then reflects the general trajectory of the medium-based art historical exercises, but more fundamentally, it speaks to the conception of what constitutes visual material, visual source, built upon the artistic hierarchy that had been firmly embedded in the discipline, in which authorship, art quality, artistic quality, iconography, and audience reception were among the most important agenda in research. It is remarkable that the scale of all 4 points of interest have expanded to an unprecedented degree by today. And as we will discuss later in this presentation, such development was possible not only through productive contestations within the field of painting over transmitted sources, but also through robust methodological engagement among scholars from various fields, which transcended the traditional divisions of medium as well as canonized sources. At the center of such interactions was archaeological mediation in approaches of Chinese art. In fact, a corpus of archaeological material had been widely available since 1979 upon the US establishment of diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, and a few scholars in the field began to pay close attention to them. Their interest at this very early phase then can be characterized into 3. For the scholars who worked exclusively on painting, some of the excavated objects and images reveal their values as complementing arguable dates and or authorship of certain transmitted paintings. For those who are interested in visual culture, some of the archaeological discoveries were found useful reconstructing material environment of a given time period. The scholars in the 3rd category were those who had already been researching exclusively on archaeological material itself, working at the disciplinary intersection between archaeology and art history. Although excavated material and archaeological sites themselves had been registered as a valuable art historical sources by this point, their potential as historical evidence was mostly built upon their face value as unfiltered reflection of material culture of given time period, rather than as relations of things that traverse the world's underground and above ground. It is my understanding that a more serious engagement with such connection innate in archaeological material is clearly visible in the two works by Woo Hong that I mentioned earlier, as well as numerous articles on funerary art he penned. In Wuliang Shrine, for example, the materiality of the main source, that is the ink rubbing of a bas-relief on stone slabs, is first recognized on its own term, rather than readily treated as a planar imagery alienated from the material bearer that was component of an architectural structure that once stood on the funerary park. In the analysis of source as a multifaceted entity as such, its connection to contemporaneous archaeological material becomes equally important at various levels. None of these materials are dealt with as an imagery isolated from its physical substance and spatial context. 20-some years from then, such approach has become standard in the field of Chinese funerary art, which keeps evolving. A glimpse at a series of proceedings of the ongoing biannual international conference on tomb art organized by Woo Hong and two art historians in China, Zhang Yan and Zhu Qingsheng, would give us a sense of breadth and depth of new scholarship utilizing archaeological material that's been produced in the past decade. Regardless of particular sources, which ranges widely from individual objects and images, be it a funerary couch or craftsman's seal, to the tomb itself as architecture, the studies presented in this venue show scholars' growing interest in potentiality of archaeological material inherently connected to the world outside the barrier chamber, reaching diverse areas of a given society. These areas of research are as diverse as the intersections of different religious practices, namely Taoist and Buddhist cultures, the locality and culture mediation at various scales, and the expanded field of visuality with the focus on pictorial representations. While some of these areas have received more attention than others, which I will address shortly with regard to the new direction of research, such scholarship largely acknowledges their source material as specimen or fragment of larger culture structures. The advancement in the field of funerary art as such has also gradually formed shared clusters of research fields between East Asia and North America, as well as Europe. Each of these three areas of research visibly growing in the recent scholarship of tomb art deserve further attention, which goes well beyond the original funerary context. First is the ways that archaeological sources are engaged in the studies of institutionalized religious practices. Largely, two lines of research have been dominant in the scholarship of Taoist and Buddhist visual cultures. One is to use archaeological finds as evidence of particular doctrinal content or ritual practices as a missing link, so to speak, in transmitted texts or other visual sources that are comfortably defined as Taoist art or Buddhist art. The other is to explore rather murky zones between the original context of archaeological sources that often defy a single religious category and what is considered orthodox practices of these religions. These two may seem to derive from the opposite positions in approaching the religious art, but in fact, they share the premise that the boundaries of religious orthodoxy are to be maintained in their framework. Such endeavors can be further developed by adopting a viewpoint that archaeological sources themselves are inscribed with relations of complex realities that cut across multiple belief systems, which is historically meaningful in itself. The second line of research that's been developed in the past decade in conjunction with archaeological intervention is the broadened scope of localism and extended cultural network. While the long-standing and systematic scholarship on this subject had been led by historians of late imperial socioeconomic history, especially with the strong focus on the framework of the physiographic macroregion since the late 1970s, interest in the cultural localism or the relative lack thereof have been shaped by political boundaries, most often based on ethnic identity of ruling regime of a given period, be it Tagbak, the Khitan, the Jurchen, the Mongol, or the Manchu. The common narrative in our history, as is the case with the studies on any cultural establishment in Chinese history, had rarely stepped out of the rigid scheme of the Han Chinese versus non-Chinese until pre-recent years. As one of the serious disadvantages of such a tautological framework was the oversimplification of the far more intricate nature of a cultural entity in reality. In recent years, certain archaeological material has been recognized as material manifestation of the complex juncture between these distinctive cultural traditions, which leads to more substantial conversations about the cultural landscape of a particular place and time, rather than predetermined by the ethnicity of maker, sponsor, or owner of that excavated material, providing with a new platform for better understanding of artistic network, dramatically shaped through both material and human agencies. Such an approach further helps to redefine constantly shifting boundaries of what was considered the local at a given time and region at various levels. When we realize the densely rhizomatic nature of archaeological sources, especially those from tombs, their potential as boundary redefining agency of visual and material world is unsurprising, be it religious, ethnopolitical, or geographical boundary. It is in this context that the last point on the archaeological intervention in the studies of Chinese pictorial art is recognized. The aforementioned agenda in the classical studies of Chinese painting, namely authorship, artistic quality, iconography, and audience reception, no longer operates solely on the premise that only the knowledge and verifiable individual masters can lead us to a sound understanding of paintings, nor that there was a single correct way for viewers to receive pictorial work. Most scholars in the field today accept the multifaceted value of paintings and or copies whose creators are unknown, for example, and acknowledge, at least theoretically, that viewers of different social, intellectual, economic, political, or religious communities would have responded to a single image differently. While largely indebted to new approaches pursued by the so-called social history of art, the remarkable development in the field of Chinese pictorial art since early 1990s also show yet another notable dimension in such an expanded vista of research that is distinctive from the general social concerns. It is a new treatment of painting not as an enclosed container of a certain meaning at the moment of completion, but rather as one of countless points of connection among visual and extra-visual sources that existed in relation to that particular work. If the social historical approach has opened up a window towards the vast social arena through which otherwise as an isolated work of art can be placed in that expanded world, this latter approach has enlivened the very work by giving it a material agency of relations, the relations in pictorial and material form. Notably, this approach deeply resonates with distinctive ways in which the archaeological material has been identified and activated as the point of connections that link the confined barrier chamber and the world above ground in many of Wu Hong's works. Indeed, in the book, Double Screen, Medium and Representation in Chinese Painting, a methodological parallel is found in his engagement of paintings to that of archaeological material. While the variety of excavated material identified as vital sources for the discussion of transmitted paintings is itself significant, which has broadened the scope of research in Chinese paintings, how they are examined in relation to those received paintings circulated above ground is what I like to emphasize here. While the book's main focus is on various aspects of visualities that were shaped through painting formats and vice versa, the painting in this work is basically dealt with as a contact point of relations that could stretch out both horizontally to contemporaneous visual and material cultures and vertically back and forth to particular pictorial traditions where a particular painting finds its historical connection. Wu Hong may not agree with this. I would like to hear what he thinks, but I'm just going to move on. In this regard, the contribution of archaeological intervention in Chinese art is not simply about acquisition of new sources on the canonized body of material and evidence, but essentially about methodology. In the process of recognizing, organizing, and incorporating archaeological sources into transmitted images and texts, the areas of epistemic holes and ruptures in the expanded field of visual world can be revealed, negotiated, and reshaped in a way to significantly advance our knowledge. The dynamic potential of excavated material as visual and material evidence has been fully recognized in Wu Hong's works, which has helped to open new horizons of scholarship in various fields that go beyond our history, such as fast-growing interest in the materiality of text, including excavated manuscripts, prints, steles, or tomb epitaphs in the fields of literature, history, and religious studies, just to name a few. In the coming years, I anticipate solid and healthy growth of our scholarship in these numerous areas of research with the gift of Wu Hong's seminar endeavors. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here and very honored to have been invited to speak. Today, I'm going to talk, my talk is From Transience to Endurance, Reflections on the Contemporary Chinese Art World. It's, well, we'll see where we go. So in 1988, as a graduate student at the University of Chicago, when I was working as an intern at the Smart Museum, Professor Wu invited me to work with him on to assist him on a exhibition that he was planning that would look at the exciting art that was coming out of China at the end of the 20th century. And this dynamic art world we chronicled in this exhibition, called Transience, and which presented artistic manifestations that were just beginning and still fleeting in an unstable art world. I mean, at that time, Chinese contemporary art was barely even a decade old, kind of considered. It was a very new phenomenon. And so I was really excited to work on it. And so I had to do a little excavation myself to find this picture, and in a pre-digital era. And you can see that the lineup of artists is just amazing. They were about to all just sort of take the global art world by storm. And I'm sort of poking my head up out of the back as the hanger-on. But it sort of got me hooked to working with artists at that point. And after I finished all my dissertation work and I finally became a curator, then I could actually move into working with live artists. And so one of the kind of the key parts of my practice has been this working with living artists and trying to embed them into the museum and into the university and to highlight artistic research. And so working with live artists to realize challenging works has become a cornerstone of my own curatorial approach at the University of Kansas. And having artists generate unrealized projects at in a university context not only awakens academic research to new approaches, but has allowed us to build partnerships in the scholarly community across disciplinary boundaries that have compelled us to venture beyond what we know or what is known. And by supporting the breadth of creative practices, this program of residencies has created new work and artistic research. And so therefore, many of the projects that I've worked on actually result in very little in the way of tangible physical objects, kind of ranging from a grass installation by Wang Tiande called Shangxia, or Up Down at the top. And then it came from the sky, which was a 2-meter tall silicone policeman that intentionally crashed to the ground periodically and eventually self-destructed. And then Chen Xiaoxiong's wonderful project called Prepared, which was a boot camp for learning about the technical and historical aspects of protest culture, that eventually ended up with Occupy KU camping on the front lawn of the museum and getting us into a lot of trouble. So it was, and then of course there was the Xi Jingmen, which Chen Xiaoxiong was also part of, and also Ozawa Tsuyoshi from Tokyo and Kim Hong-suk from Seoul created a new project there called Xi Jing School, which involved a history class about getting drunk so we could all forget. And it's been a really great, it's been a wonderful working with artists. And so I knew that for my next big project, I really wanted to bring artists in at the very beginning and create commissions as part of this large exhibition that I was working on that took over 6 years of field work called Temporal Turn. And at the heart of this was this kind of deep dive into these different cultural contexts. And so Temporal Turn, I wanted to invite artists to come to the museum and create new commissions on site. In total, I invited 4 artists: Rohini Devasher from Delhi, Sahej Rahal from Mumbai, Pak Jae-yong from Seoul, and Konoike Tomoko from Tokyo. And the involvement as they made objects and I installed the show greatly expanded many of the themes in the exhibition and breathed life into the experience of the exhibition for our students, faculty, and the broader community. And Temporal Turn was the result of several years of intense field work in which I crisscrossed Greater Asia in an attempt to plunge deeper and deeper into the complex ecologies of Asian contemporary art that was taking shape at the time. This deep dive approach attempts to link the cavernous reservoirs of historical consciousness with contemporary modalities of artistic practice, an approach that formed the bedrock of my own curatorial approach. And also my approach was informed by kind of iterative interactions that took shape through open-ended speculative approaches to time and history that I encountered in studio visit after studio visit from New Delhi to Beijing. And this diverse range of temporal modalities that surfaced cast history into something that was endlessly malleable, something akin to the multiverse of physics and theoretical physics. Yes, the speculation and sci-fi inspired art that I built the exhibition around also served as a powerful device for decolonizing and disrupting the kind of linear temporal modality or models that have tended to dominate the underlying structures of the Euro-American art world. And reframing the implicit structures of power of the globalized art world. This recalibrating of the globalized art world is best seen if we return to China. So one of the In the first decades of the 21st century, have been characterized by a combination of unprecedented notoriety for artists and commercial success in Chinese contemporary art world. But then also the past decade, we can see, has been described by, these monuments of extraordinary institutional growth. We can trace the catalyst of this institutional expansion to two key events in the early 21st century. First, the relocation of the Central Academy of Fine Arts, or CAFA, from Beijing's city center to its outskirts in Wangjin. With this relocation of CAFA, in many ways followed the migration of contemporary artists to the fringes of Beijing, where they had already started to occupy the dusty, abandoned factories in Dashanzi that had become to be known as 798. And so even, Professor Wu was sort of on the vanguard of that and curating one of the first shows, major shows in these abandoned spaces of Rong and Inri's photography that documented so much of the avant-garde art that was happening at the end of the 20th century. But with the development of these areas, artists were constantly pushing further and further out, kind of following with them the other sort of fringe population in Beijing, the migrant workers. Actually occupying these little villages like Caochangdi, then also became the places of where several high-end galleries are now located. And so, with this new campus, with the new campus of the Central Academy came a new university. There were the new university art museums at CAFA, and these and alternate exhibition spaces in 79 quickly came prominent commercial galleries like Pace and private art museums like the Ulan's Center for Contemporary Art. And as Wangjin and 798 developed and became increasingly codified, artists continued to push the boundaries of relocating to new studio spaces in villages of migrant workers, another prominent group of refugees occupying the fringes of Beijing, in places like Caochangdi that I'm showing here, and other outlying villages. The result has been an expansive zone of high-end commercial galleries, alternative artist-run spaces, private museums, and immense artist colonies like Songzhuang, where several thousand creative professionals are located. And on my recent trip out there, there were a lot of rumblings about even this area, this colony will soon be disappearing. So it'll be another push as the unquenchable wave of development kind of devours the outer edges of Beijing. Part of all of this has been this immense museum boom. That is a quick and significant assessment of how Beijing's art world has been developing over the past decade. However, what I feel is one of the most exciting and telling manifestations of the Chinese art world in recent years has been the boom of brick and mortar, or should I say maybe steel and glass museums, not just in Beijing and Shanghai, but all over the country. So, according to official statistics from 2000 to 2011, nearly 2,000 new museums opened in China, and in the last 8 years, that probably has doubled. There haven't really been any good statistics that have emerged in recent years, but so this is kind of old data, but it's just been an amazing moment. And examples of state-funded projects range from CAFA's art museum, designed by a Japanese architect that opened in 2008. And then there's the immense power station of art in Shanghai, which is a repurposed power plant. It is not only the first major state-run museum dedicated to contemporary art in China, but with over 38,000 square meters, the largest. I think you can almost fit Tate Modern inside. So, however, the museum boom has not just been confined to the contemporary art or to the urban centers, as seen by the new Ordos Museum in Kangbashi in Inner Mongolia that was designed by the highly inventive and experimental MAD or MAD architectural studio. sort of a kind of response to the Ordos and to the and to Buckminster Fully. And recently, Matt has also opened the spaceship-like Chinese art world, Chinese Wood Sculpture Museum in China's northeastern city of Harbin. What is even more remarkable is the proliferation of private museums in places like in Shanghai. But over the past decade, the contemporary Chinese art world has transitioned from this early years of transience and uncertainty to a period marked by monumental fluorescence of durable infrastructure and institutional expansion. But what kind of ground has the museum boom really provided for artists? Has it just been a period of shifting sands? And what kind of solidity has it really provided? Is that what is really needed? I don't really know, but thank you.
Don't worry, I won't use up the rest 15 minutes. Let me begin with this image. Jan van Eyck's oil painting depicting a couple standing in a room. The mirror on the back wall reflects two more figures standing in the doorway. One of them may be the painter himself, who left his signature and the date above the mirror. In an article published in 1934, Panofsky argued that the painting served as a legal record of the marriage of the couple, with the presence of two witnesses and the signature of one. Although his argument remained controversial, the way Panofsky analyzed the painting left a long-lasting impact on art history, which we call iconography. The attention Panofsky paid to the mirror on the back wall also led to the fascination with the visual device called image within image. About 2 centuries later came another masterpiece by Velázquez. The painter himself is present in the painting, standing at work in front of a huge canvas. The central figure in the foreground is a princess and her entourage. A mirror is hung on the back wall. The mirror reflects the arrival of the royal couple, the king and the queen. In The Order of Things, first published in 1966, Foucault pointed out that the royal couple appears to be placed outside the picture space in a position that the viewer would have stood. Therefore, the painter not only acknowledged the presence of viewer, but further empowered the viewer by making the viewer assuming the position of the ruler. Whether or not Foucault's argument withstands optical verification is still under debate, but the way he discussed the painting challenged the standard practices of art historians and led to a movement in art history several decades later, which emphasized close reading, readership or viewership, and semiotics. It goes without saying that the mirror as a visual device to converge the royal couple and the viewer in the painting intensify the scholarly interest in image within image or intertextuality in pictorial art. About 1.5 centuries later came yet another interesting painting, Ingrid's depiction of Raphael and his first lover in a studio. Ingrid turned the easel around and made the canvas partially visible to the viewer. Instead of the reflection on a mirror, Ingrid played with the representation on a canvas. The painting showed Raphael embracing his lover on his laps, but turning away and looking at the image of the lover he created. Who does the painter love more? The real woman or the represented woman? Who is more dominant, the man or the woman positioned higher at the center and looking at the viewer? No doubt Ingres left this question unanswered on purpose as a way to respond to the long tradition of image within image in European painting. Now let's turn our attention to China. Traditional Chinese painters did not use canvases or easels, nor did they pay much attention to mirrors. Does this mean that Chinese painters had no interest in all kinds of tricks image within image could possibly generate on the pictorial surface? The answer is no. Rather than canvases on mirror, rather than canvases or mirrors, Chinese painters made the best of screens. For example, the portrait of famous literati painter Ni Zan, produced by his friend Zhang Yu in the 14th century. The painting depicts the painter seated on a couch, holding a brush on one hand and a piece of blank paper in the other, as if he were thinking about composing a painting. What he would most likely paint is the kind of landscape on the screen standing behind the couch. The landscape, summed up by others as one river between two banks, is distinguished by its simple composition and dry, monotone brushwork. The minimalist style established by Ni Zan was highly praised by literati as a reflection of his impeccable moral character and uncompromising attitude toward life. Using the screen to create an illusion of image within image, Zhang Yu produced a portrait that shows the physical likeness, the individual style, and the inner spirit of the painter all at once. A few decades later, another painter, Liu Guandao, had complicated the matter. The painting depicts a gentleman in a garden, comfortably lying on a couch. Next to him stands a screen. Let's focus on what's on the screen. The screen shows another painted screen with a landscape that favors monumental mountains. In front of the screen is another gentleman seated on a couch. On a low table next to him are books, brushes, and inkstone, indicating that the gentleman is in his study. What is the relation between the two figures within and without the painted screen? The figure within is looking at the figure without, but the figure without does not gaze back. Instead, he's looking at the two maids walking toward him. Many interesting questions arise in this complicated visual rendition. Does the double screen suggest that the double side of the gentleman, diligent as a scholar who performed duties in a study, and lay back as an idler in a garden, enjoying art, music, and women? Does looking away from the double screen indicate that pleasures win over duty? Or does the double screen serve as conscious reminder of duty, even when one is seeking for pleasure? The painter used the double screen to create an illusion that doubles the complexity of image within image, which would call for multiple connotations. A few decades later came yet another endeavor. A painting depicts a gentleman seated in front of a painted screen in a study. Apparently, the gentleman was not a fan of monotone landscape, but of colorful birds and flowers. What is striking is the painting hung on the screen. It appears to be the portrait of the seated gentleman. Are we looking at the cases of Narcissus? Here, the man fell in love with his own image in the portrait, so much so that he had to display his portrait in his private quarter. Since we know nothing about the artist, we have no idea whether or not it is a self-portrait. If it were a self-portrait, then did the medieval Chinese painter think the same way as Ingres did, playing with the love of an artist for his own creation? Not depending on mirrors or canvases, Chinese painters made the best of screens to elaborate their vision of image within image, which is no less interesting and complicating than the European vision. However, it is not until 1996, when Wu Hong published his book, The Double Screen, that incredibly rich visual vocabulary with which Chinese painters have been playing for centuries finally came to light. If we salute Panofsky and Foucault for their contribution to our discipline, should we also consider adding a chapter for Wu Hong when we talk, teach, and write about history of art history? Let's move on to a different subject matter. The depiction of ruins has been an established motif since the Renaissance, when people rediscovered the Greco-Roman civilization. Traveling to Rome and representing all kinds of ruins around the city became a fashion in the 18th century, when things classical were upheld as gold standard. German artists in the 19th century added a twist to the genre in their quest for identity by replacing the Roman ruins with the Gothic ones. Roman or Gothic, European painters share the aesthetics of decay out of their appreciation of architectural fragments from the past. In comparison, Chinese began their first antiquarian movement in the 10th century, several hundred earlier than their European counterpart. Even though they study and value the physical remains of the past, Chinese did not cultivate the aesthetics of decay in art. Nothing is more telling than the juxtaposition of the two paintings on the screen. Both painters similarly position ruins in the wintry forests, but the way they portray the ruins are in stark contrast. Whereas Friedrich dramatized the destructive status of the medieval church, the Chinese painter managed to present the almost 1,000-year-old stone stele in a perfect condition without any cracks or erosion on its surface. The aesthetics of decay in art was first introduced to China in the 19th century through European photographers who captured what they saw with their cameras in their trips to China. Those images, such as the one revealing the natural decay of an pagoda, were circulated both inside and outside the Chinese world. And then Chinese went to Europe to study art in the early 20th century. The depiction of Roman ruins became part of their learning repertoire. However, modern Chinese painters did not embrace the motif with passion until they were struck by the Sino-Japanese War, which started 4 years earlier than the Second World War. For example, Gao Jianfu used the traditional Chinese medium, ink and color on paper, to represent Chinese city in ruins after bombing. The sentiment here is no longer poetic or nostalgic, but traumatic and devastating. Contemporary Chinese artists continue to develop the motif, not as a response to wars, but as a protest to undesirable social or political conditions, such as Zhang Dali's performance in 1998. It features the old house in the process of demolition as a result of a governmental push to modernize the capital, Beijing. A gigantic human head was carved out of a wall in ruins. Seen through the human head was a glimpse of the shining roof of the Forbidden City. Likewise, the sentiment here is not poetic or nostalgic, but sad and sarcastic. In short, there is a shift in the perception of ruins in Chinese art from the pre-modern to the modern eras. The European aesthetics facilitate the shift, But it was the immediate challenges, not the remote past, that truly propelled the shift in the Chinese context. Again, it is not until 2012, when Wu Hong published his book, A Story of Ruins, that incredibly rich development of a pictorial motif from the past to the present, from the west to the east, finally came to light. As you probably still remember, this is the title of my talk. As art historian, we deal with differences and similarities in visual form on a daily basis. Sometimes we emphasize the uniqueness of a certain style by comparing and contrasting the differences. Sometimes we establish the connection between or among art objects and look into possible interaction by lining up their similarities. The scale of our research can be as focused as an object or an artist. It can also be as broad as a period, a region, a nation, or a cultural area. This is our history with boulders with which we feel comfortable to practice. More often than not, invention requires people to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. What would our history without boulders look like? How about we look into neither A or B, but in between A and B? As introduced earlier, Wu Hong's The Double Screen articulates the unique vision of image within image in the Chinese tradition, but the scholarly interest in that visual device began in the circle of European art historians, not in the circle of Chinese art historians. As a result, Wu Hong's book is an in-between. On the one hand, it participates in an academic discussion in the field of European art. On the other, it brings to life a crucial concern of medieval Chinese painters, which was completely buried and forgotten. Wu Hong's A Story of Ruins is another in-between. In this project, Wu Hong did not linger over the differences between Chinese and European painters in the pre-modern era. Rather, he established a direct connection between the two worlds in the modern age and dug deeper into how a foreign pictorial motif was circulated, received, and eventually transformed in the Chinese context. The key to Wu Hong's success in his cross-cultural project is that he made tremendous efforts to contextualize art objects under discussion. Specific cultural, social, or political condition made each of his accounts at once local and global. Along the way Wu Hong has paved, more directions can be explored. To begin with, artistic exchange on the world stage had happened long before the modern era. Let me give you an interesting example. This is a renowned terracotta army of the first emperor in China. A figurine like this came from the initial excavation in the 1970s and has been toured around the world as indigenously Chinese. But some have naked figurines unearthed in 1999 complicated the picture. The artisan who made those figurines not only handled anatomy well, they also adopted the contrapposto pose, letting the weight of the body rest on one leg and thus free another leg to make the figurines look more dynamic. Some scholars could not help but put forward the idea of Hellenistic inspiration. Others, however, are skeptical because there is so far no reliable evidence survived in Central Asia to account for the transmission of large-scale figural art in this period between East and West. Suffice to say, this is an exciting but challenging case, and the case is far from closed. Let's not forget that artistic exchange took place not only from West to East, but also from East to West. For example, in 1996 3 lacquer boxes with elaborate decoration, most likely produced in the east coast of China in the 1st century BCE, were discovered on the Crimean Peninsula. How did these lacquer boxes travel more than 5,000 miles from China to Crimea? What kind of impact these Chinese objects might have had made on the local community? Likewise, this is an exciting but challenging case, and the case is yet far from closed. When we consider art history without borders, we cannot avoid an uneasy division between Western and non-Western art. Even though the term non-Western art has been contested for 1 or 2 decades, the underlying concept continues to exist. There is no denial that our discipline has been Eurocentric since its inception. Theory and methods generated from that region has been dictated how we study art, how we look at, think of, and write about art. More fields and positions outside European art have been opened, but the intellectual discourse does not catch up. As a specialist in Chinese art, I was asked to be a reader for senior essays, MA thesis, doctoral qualifying paper, and PhD dissertation in Byzantine art, Islamic art, Indian art, African art, and Mesoamerican art in 1 or 2 institutes I served in the past. My personal experience attests to the intellectual absurdity in our academic life. Almost every institute has a cohesive program in Western art, meaning European art and its extension. But not a single institute ever offers a comprehensive training in non-Western art, meaning anything but European art and its extension. And yet, we expect our colleagues outside European art to take on the whole world, whether or not whatever his or her specialty is. Are we satisfied with our status quo in an intellectual sense? If not, how do we break through the artificial boundary between Western and non-Western art and create a kind of global artistry that has its suitable theory, methods, intellectual integrity, and pedagogical practices? Wu Hong's works have been inspiring in this regard, but we still have a very, very long way to go. As many of you would agree, when we have the privilege of knowing the author in person, we appreciate his or her works better. In the concluding part of my talk, I feel obliged to add that Wu Hong's interest in ruins may run deeper than a mere intellectual exercise. This is a photo of Wu Hong taken in 1961 when he was 16 years old. This is another photo taken 3 decades later, after he had finished his PhD at Harvard and embarked on his teaching career there. Full of hope, the young Wu Hong did not know that in 5 years, he would have been thrown into the Cultural Revolution in China. In a world upside down, Wu Hong literally lost 10 years of his worthy life. No way could he have any academic pursuit, for all universities in the entire country were shut down for a decade. Worse, he was sent to a reform camp. The Cultural Revolution ruins millions of lives, including Wu Hong's. How could one possibly deal with such an irretrievable loss of time, the golden age of one's life? The most courageous answer is probably to race with time and to fill the blank with mighty words. That's precisely what Wu Hong has been doing. These are what Wu Hong has published in pre-modern art. These are what Wu Hong has published and curated in modern and contemporary art. In addition, he has been teaching Chinese art for 31 years. Among his advisees, 33 finished their PhD degree or working at faculty or curatorial positions. 10 are at various stages in the PhD program. Looking at the magnitude of what Wu Hong has accomplished, I don't know what else I can say other than hailing him as a Superman of our discipline. Sorry, and I have to thank Bonnie Zheng from Oberlin College. He tallied all the number. The spread of 3 decades is several generations. It's harder to know each other. Today, we honor Wu Hong as a distinguished scholar who never ceased to challenge the status quo and defines issues with innovative perspectives. I believe we also honor an exceptional person who never yields under any circumstances and who always turns the situation from the worst to the best. For decades, Wu Hong has demonstrated to us that writing about art is beautiful and that living a life fully is beautiful. Let me end up here. Thank you.
I'm quite, hi. Thank you very much. I'm really quite speechless after all of this. Actually, I don't have time anymore. But I do have a paper. I think maybe there are people waiting outside, maybe, what's that? So it's okay. Actually, it's rather a little bit serious paper. If you want to hear, there are a lot of interactions with previous papers. Should I deliver it or? Okay, thank you very much. I will do it. It won't be too long. First, I'm very humbled by this extraordinary honor, and really want to thank CAA for bestowing it on me. I also really want to thank these 4 speakers we just heard, who, as you know, were once upon a time my students, but who are now, you can see, they're exploring various frontiers in Chinese art history and beyond. Like them, actually, we had a sort of agreement. We want to use this case to think about the field. It won't be just about me. So like them, I also intend to use this occasion to think about the field as an integral part of our history, to share with you some of my current thought about its past and its present, maybe imply the future, but mainly the past and present. I have titled this talk, what is that? There's a, can I have the image? Yeah. Where? Oh, yeah. So this is the one. Okay. Actually, that's my only slides. Just give you the title. So you can read the title is Chinese Art, Us, Global Art History. Chinese Art History, Us, Global Art History. For 2 reasons, I just named this talk, this title for 2 reasons. First, as a modern discipline, the field of Chinese art history was global, in essence, from its very inception in the 19th and 20th centuries. That's my understanding. From very beginning, it was a global art history. I will explain why this is the case and contemplate the implication of this. And second, well, the field of Chinese art in this early stage was largely split between China in the West and Japan somewhat. A strong collaborative effort among international scholars has emerged in recent years to transcend the East-West binary, and in this process, to redefine the field in a new global environment. It is well known that China had a long tradition of art historical writing, producing the first comprehensive painting history as early as the 9th century. But the modern field of Chinese art history, either in China or in the West, didn't really naturally grow out of this ancient scholarship. It emerged as a part of sweeping global modernization movement in the 19th and 20th centuries, which reorganized local knowledge into supposedly universal systems of disciplines. In art history, after the birth of the discipline in Europe in the 18th century, it soon expanded its focus to include non-European art traditions. Early ethno-art historians were all trained in European art. The criteria and methods they use in collecting, evaluating, and interpreting non-European works were naturally derived from European art history. Thus, when the British Museum established Asian art galleries in the 19th century, and William Anderson wrote a descriptive and historical account of the East Asian painting collection in that museum in 1886, Chinese artworks were classified into categories that were pre-established in European art. Their developments were mapped out according to stylistic evolutions. At that time, similar classifications and formal analysis provided a unified basis to assemble heterogeneous art traditions into encyclopedic museums. The first versions of a globalized Chinese art history were produced in this context. The idea of art history as a humanistic discipline was introduced to China in the early 20th century, where it gave birth to a new kind of art historical writing that instantly delegitimized the old-fashioned literatic discourse on art. Such a breakaway from tradition was possible because the country was undergoing a profound transformation into a modern nation state. Reformist intellectuals not only adopted Enlightenment ideology to reshape China's social political systems, but also strived to rewrite the country's history based on so-called scientific models provided by Europe and Japan. Art history, or 美术史, entered Chinese language in 1911 and became a required course in teacher schools in 1912, the year of the Republican Revolution. Unlike traditional Chinese scholarship on art, which focused exclusively on painting and calligraphy, this modern art history, modern Chinese art history, significantly broadened the scope of Chinese art to include sculpture and architecture, religious icons and temple murals, tombs and funerary artifacts, and various kinds of crafts. While this redefinition of Chinese art was largely inspired by Western precedents, the new Chinese art history invented in China didn't simply copy Western prototypes. First of all, it had a regional or national framework that differed fundamentally from the multinational or multi-regional structure of a Western encyclopedic museum. This regional focus encouraged Chinese art historians to utilize the local resources, including rich texture materials and architecture finds, and to develop close ties with other social and humanistic disciplines established around the same time. The formation of this regional Chinese art history was also indebted to very important interdisciplinary events in the early 20th century, such as the excavation of the first Shang capital, Anyang, the establishment of Dunhuang studies, and the investigation of ancient architecture remains. Eugene talked about it. At the same time, early 20th century, European, Japanese, Indian, Russian art was introduced through translation and reproduction. When China's first art history department was founded in 1957 in Beijing, I enrolled in its third class. It offered actually a thoroughly globalized program in which ancient and modern Chinese art was taught side by side with Western art. A course on Marxist aesthetics started actually from Hegel and Kant. The situation described here was certainly not limited to China, but indicated the emergence of a globalized art history characterized by the construction of various regional or national art history narratives in non-European languages. Formulated roughly from the early 20th century through the Cold War, each of these regional narratives, had these specific materials and chronology, but all share the basic classification of art forms and pattern of a linear evolution. On the surface, these regional art histories were written by local scholars to meet local needs. But because they thoroughly internalized the concept and logics of Western art historical writing, it can be argued that these local art histories were actually more global than their Western models. This seems paradoxical, but it is not, I believe. The reason is that although a Western encyclopedic museum gathered artworks from different places around the globe, its global collection was enabled by expansion of Western political and economic power, not really inspired by the art traditions which produce the collected works. In contrast, the new regional art histories written in China and other places, although regional in scope and focus, emerged from real interactions between different cultural and intellectual systems and signifies these regions entering into a global space via the rediscovery of their own art. Due to their inherent geographical focus and linear evolutionary approach, these regional art histories are constructed as self-contained narratives that privilege national art traditions. Interactions between countries and regions are played down or even denied. This was especially true in China during the period of 1960s and 70s. In the Cold War atmosphere and during the Cultural Revolution, Chinese art historians were cut off from their international colleagues. Officially sanctioned history books rejected any influence from the outside world. During the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 76, our schools, our programs were stopped, except for routine works in a few museums. The young field of Chinese art history in China seems suddenly to have vanished. Retrospectively, this extreme situation, I believe, also ended what I consider the first stage of a globalized Chinese art history, or the creation of the field based on foreign models, including one from the former Soviet Union. The beginning of the second stage of globalized Chinese art history, which has continued to this day, started from the reopening of art programs in China in the late 1970s, and the re-establishment of international scholarly communications in the following decades. These changes owed a great deal to the new political conditions, especially the end of the Cold War and China's new open door policy. But the transformation of our history itself in the West also promised a new kind of globalized Chinese art history. Participating in the trends of new art history, scholars such as James Cahill, Michael Sullivan, Richard Barnhart, and Eileen Lang departed from the old revolutionary approach, historicizing Chinese art in various ways. Their contextual research privileged the historical investigation over pure formal analysis, replacing macrocosmic narratives with reconstructed art historical events. Although these scholars still focus on works in museum collections, their research led them to explore the original historical circumstances behind the creation of those works. This shift in methodology provided a new basis to bridge Western and Chinese scholarship on Chinese art. During the same period, a group of Chinese art historians trained in both Chinese and Western systems, such as Wen Fang and Zhu Jinli, started working in Western institutions, universities, and museums, and they introduced another crucial mode to develop a globalized Chinese art history. Teaching and writing about Chinese art in English, their practice is profoundly translingual, using foreign vocabulary and syntax to convey local historical experience, linguistic nuances, and cultural specificities. The 1980s and 90s was a very exciting period for this field. Historians of Chinese art based in different places finally converged and shared research interests, where scholarly publications, archaeological information, and exhibitions circulated beyond the national borders. Such exchange had an instant impact on Western scholarship on Chinese art, as demonstrated by the many groundbreaking English publications during those decades. On the other side of the Pacific Ocean, the Institute of Art History was established in Taipei in 1990, providing a crucial venue to connecting different scholarly traditions on Chinese art, not just Chinese and Western, but also Japanese. So Taipei provided a very important venue at the time. In mainland China, the field of art history started to expand rapidly after the 1990s. Since then, it has produced an astonishing number of books and articles. Its appeal to students and young scholars keeps growing. Some large, vibrant translation projects have continuously introduced Western studies of Chinese art to Chinese scholars. Dissertations written in the past 10 years or so clearly reflect an awareness of different methods and different approaches. More and more Chinese graduate students are studying art history in the West. Some of them have returned to China after graduation and are now teaching in top universities. So speaking now in 2018, I no longer see a clear distinction between Western and Chinese scholarships on Chinese art. Differences in language, readership, and academic environment certainly exist, but global collaboration and mutual learning has become the dominant trend. To me, the main problem we face in this field now is therefore no longer the East-West binary, which has been largely resolved over the past 30 to 40 years. So what are the new challenges? This is certainly a very big question which we can all think about. I have been pondering it on two different directions, in two different directions. The first is to re-examine key concepts used in this field, the field of Chinese art, which are mainly loanwords derived from the study of European art. Here I'm talking about concepts as basic as image, iconography, style, representation, gaze, monument. These are all loanwords derived from other sources. While these concepts have facilitated modern scholarship on Chinese art, their adaptation was not based on first-hand research of China's art historical reality. I should emphasize that I'm not in any way advocating replacing them with traditional Chinese terms. Rather, I hope that new research on Chinese art will simultaneously reflect on these so-called universal concept vis-a-vis individual art practice. And will, in this process, redefine this concept or expand their meaning. Such integral historical/theoretical projects will in turn encourage comparative studies between different art traditions that will become the basis of a truly global art history, I feel, in the future. This is related to the other proposal I would like to make. As a rigid division between Western and non-Western art is gradually collapsing, there have emerged possibilities to develop a new three-dimensional structure for art historical research and education. In this structure, vertical, regional, or national art histories can be connected into layered, horizontal world art histories. For example, global ancient art, global religious art, global contemporary art are all possible examples. This structure doesn't abandon the established historiography of regional art traditions. We are now using one global art to replace all these rich traditions, but provides platforms on which regional art histories can be linked on both historical and conceptual levels. Forging such cross-regional ties can potentially reshape our historical knowledge as well as art institutions, such as museums and art history department. My colleagues and I have started experimenting with this structure at the University of Chicago. Of course, this is just one possible model to connect regional art history and global art history. So let me stop here. Let me thank CAA for giving me this occasion to speak, and thank you all for listening. Thank you.